Always choose orange.
Hello and welcome to Always Choose Orange, the show that provides actionable ways to develop and maintain a thriving creative process. I'm your host, Alex, and today's guest is Henry Lien. Henry is a speculative fiction writer who was born in Taiwan and currently based in Hollywood, California. Henry is best known for his middle grade fantasy series Pea Sprout Chen, a genre bending saga that blends martial arts action, figure skating flair, and sharp coming of age dynamics. A mashup that one reviewer memorably described as Hermione Granger meets Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, meets The Ice Capades, meets Mean Girls. In addition to Pea Sprout Chen, Henry writes short fiction, appearing in publications such as Asimov's Science Fiction, Analog Science Fiction and Fact, and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. He also writes essays and nonfiction that explore Eastern storytelling traditions, identity, culture, and creativity. His latest book, Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, The Art of Eastern Storytelling, was released earlier this year and explores Eastern narrative structures, mythic traditions, and cross-cultural storytelling techniques through the lens of film, literature, and video games. Before devoting himself full-time to writing, Henry worked as an attorney and fine art dealer. Today, he also mentors emerging writers, teaching creative writing at institutions like the UCLA Extension Writers Program, a role for which he's been recognized with an Outstanding Instructor of the Year award. In our conversation, Henry and I talk about what it was like to leap headfirst into writing at age 42, including his formative time at the Clarion Workshop, where he directly learned from renowned authors like George R.R. Martin, Kelly Link, and Chuck Palahniuk. We explore some of the themes from his new book, including the East Asian four-act structure, cultural appropriation, and the differences between a typical Western story and a typical Eastern story. We even touch on the use of circular narrative structures in the level design of the Metroid games. It was a fascinating, mind-blowing conversation for me. I highly recommend checking out Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird. It's an amazing book. It focuses on narrative structure. It's absolutely riveting. It's a page turner. It mixes video games, film, literature. It explores circular narratives, and it talks about a bunch of things from the movie Parasite to the boss fight of a Legend of Zelda game. Yeah, it's fantastic. So, anyways, without further ado, here it is, my conversation with Henry Lien.
Always choose orange.
Henry, thanks again for taking the time to talk with me and come on here. And I've been really looking forward to this because I told you in my email when I reached out, but I just read Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird a couple months ago, and it blew my mind. A lot of really powerful ideas in there, and there's so much that I want to talk about. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so I want to definitely get into that book, but where I actually want to start, as I was doing some research and learning more about you, I read that you really committed to being a writer at age 42 after 10 years as an attorney, after time as an art dealer. And so I'm really curious what that journey was like. Was that something that you feel like unfolded, this sort of love for writing? Or was there sort of a moment where it hit you and you felt like this is something I want to do and I didn't know that before?
Well, I didn't realize that I had been preparing to be a writer in my other careers. And yeah, I'm a lover of literature, lifelong lover of literature, but I had a number of life experiences that really reshuffled my priorities and made me look at the fact that we all have a very limited time on this planet. And that includes loss, and loss can be very inspiring if we decide it's going to be. And in the middle of my life, I just looked in the mirror one day and I saw a 42-year-old man with a receding hairline, and I snapped and came out openly as an aspiring writer, and I owned up to the fact that I've always wanted to tell stories. Now, I had been telling stories and preparing for this seeming whiplash left turn into writing in my prior careers, and I just didn't realize it. I started out as an attorney. I was a litigator. And litigators are storytellers. Mm-hmm. They have to tell a story in court, and they have to be good at it because the stakes are very high. It could be somebody's livelihood. It could be somebody's family. It could be the things that matter the most. I mean, just this side of life and death. I wasn't doing criminal cases, sure, but they are the highest possible stakes that most people will ever face. And my job as a litigator was to tell the story of these other people and make them compelling to a judge or a jury. And so I was telling stories about people besides myself all that time I was a litigator. And then I became an art dealer for 10 years. And I had a gallery in West Hollywood. And that seemed like it would be completely different from being a litigator, but I found it was not. Because here's the thing, people will walk into a gallery and they will hopefully have some sort of emotional connection with an artwork, but it's different to have an emotional experience and to open up your checkbook and write a check for $30,000. So how do we get from point A to point B? And I discovered that my litigation experience just stepped right up. It was about reducing to words, compelling words, what was ephemeral and fleeting and spectral. These emotions that people were having, they wanted them validated with words. Words were the door into the artwork, the permanent door into the artwork. Words made the artwork, or the feelings in response to the artwork, real. And I found that, like being a litigator, I was suddenly reducing to compelling words the vision of the artist that created the work. And being able to express in words what people might be feeling, it made it real in a way that nothing else can. And it got them to the comfort to open up the checkbook and write a check for $30,000. So I was always telling the stories of these characters, whether it was my client as an attorney, whether it was the artist that I was representing as an art dealer. I was always learning on the job with big stakes. We're talking a lot of money, or we're talking people's livelihoods. I was learning how to tell compelling stories. And so when I decided to become a writer, it was quite effortless to transfer those skills to writing.
Okay.
That's a very long answer. I'm sorry.
No, I love that. I love that. And like what you're saying about art specifically is, I found that to be so true in my life. So I think about like being introduced to Van Gogh, for example, and some of his last paintings of those wheat fields with like the crows flying away and stuff, and knowing the story of what happened at the end of his life after that makes those pictures just emotionally impact me in such a different way than if I just saw it. That's beautiful as it is, but that story adds that other layer. So I think that's super, super insightful. So, okay, so you have this experience as an attorney and then as an art dealer, and you go into writing, and you said that you found it sort of effortless in a way because you'd been telling stories the whole time. How did you learn the actual craft of writing? So you have these stories and you know how to tell a story, but storytelling is one skill, and I feel like arranging words in a way that emotionally impacts people is similar. It's like a Venn diagram overlap, but it's a little bit different. Like, how did you end up learning the craft?
Well, I did a number of things. The very first step was not intended to be a craft lesson for myself. I mean, I had exposure. I have an education, and I had some basic writing skills, but I had never explored creative writing. And it's ironic because I took one English class. I went to a university that was well known for its creative writing program. And I took one English class, and I was the pet of the professor. And my buddy in the class was this fellow named Andy Greer. And we remained in contact, and he continued on to pursue writing professionally. And I panicked. You know, immigrant kid, first generation immigrant. And I felt I had to study something that was going to pay back my parents for the investment in my education. So I shifted gears, never took another English class, certainly not any creative writing class. And I studied international relations because that was going to, the common wisdom was that was going to make me more seductive to law schools. And it worked.
Yeah.
But the ironic thing is that my buddy Andy Greer went on to become Andrew Sean Greer, who won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel Less.
Wow.
So I felt like, you know, that there goes that train. And let's see what I can do to make up for, the 20 some years of not looking at that part of myself. And I'm a kind of DIY guy. So I sat down with a particular novel that was structurally very complex and clever. And I sat down and I just mapped out what was happening chapter for chapter. And I was able to reveal to myself the architecture of that novel. And I thought, okay, that is within reach. This is intricate choreography here for this particular novel, but that's within reach. I've given myself tools to create an X-ray of a beloved novel that is objectively very complicated, and that felt like a revelation. And I also realized I wanted to see what I had missed out on by not taking any creative writing courses. And so I just asked myself, well, what kind of writing do I like to write? Well, I like to write speculative fiction. I mean, what kind of writing do I like to read? I like to read speculative fiction, science fiction, and fantasy. And I asked myself, well, who's my favorite current writer? And I said, Ted Chiang. And Ted Chiang, just by coincidence, went to the same college as I did. He was just 1 year ahead of me.
Oh, wow.
And so all the arrows in the universe were pointing in one direction. So I asked myself, how did Ted Chiang become a writer? And I Googled his biography, and I saw that shortly after he graduated from college, he went to a writing workshop called Clarion. And I said, well, what's that? And I realized that it's a very prestigious, selective writing workshop for speculative fiction writers. And unfortunately, the deadline to apply was just 2 weeks away. So I quickly wrote something and submitted, and I got in. And it was the happiest time of my life. It was very hard to get into that workshop because George R.R. Martin was one of the instructors in the year that the series Game of Thrones was becoming the biggest show in the world. Season 2 was just coming out. Okay. And so everybody was trying to get into the workshop that particular year because George was teaching. And I got in, and that was a huge boost of affirmation. And I applied myself diligently. I've never worked harder than those 6 weeks that we were living and working with writers like George R.R. Martin and Chuck Palahniuk and Stephen Graham Jones and Kelly Link. I've never worked harder. And at the end of it, I came out with, it's not that I developed skills, but I realized that I got affirmation that my instincts were quite good on how to tell a compelling story. That I don't know that I was a natural storyteller, but somewhere along the way, I understood how to capture people's attention, how to observe things, and how to turn that into words. And there was also a big investment. I mean, there is the idea of the gesture, the sacrifice. This is taking 6 weeks out of your life. It's a residential workshop, 6 weeks, and it's not cheap. And knowing that I was not funded by anybody, I had a business, I had an art gallery that I had to figure out how to continue operating remotely while I was away in Seattle for 6 weeks. And that gesture, that great ritual sacrifice meant to me as a middle-aged man that I couldn't just experiment and find myself. I had to leverage this. And I had to be strategic about it. And that's how I got started in writing.
Going to Clarion and then coming out of that, right? You said 6 weeks, like the hardest that you've ever worked. And then, so how far after that was your first short story published?
The year after, It was a novelette called Pearl Rehabilitative Colony for Ungrateful Daughters. And it was published in Asimov's the following year.
Cool. Okay. Were you working on that at that time? Like, did you already have these ideas, or was that sort of coming straight out after?
That was actually a story that I wrote at Clarion West for Chuck Palahniuk, who is most famous for writing Fight Club. I wrote that story specifically for him, and it was well received by Chuck, and it got published pretty soon after Clarion.
Okay. Is there any, so those are some like really notable names, obviously, like you mentioned. Is there any piece of advice from any of them, whether it's George or Kelly or Chuck, that has sort of stuck with you over the years?
Absolutely. But the one that I teach, I also teach writing myself. And one of the things that I transmit to my writers came directly from George R.R. Martin. One of the first things that he said to us during our initial meeting, like before classes even started, we just hung out on a Sunday afternoon. And one of the first things he said to us was he paraphrased William Faulkner when William Faulkner won the Nobel Prize for Literature. But George actually said it in a more succinct and applicable way. And the quote was, "There is nothing worth writing about except the human heart in conflict with itself." And you see that all over A Song of Ice and Fire and the TV show Game of Thrones. You know, no real heroes, no real villains, just peoples whose hearts are divided against themselves, trying to figure out what their values are and live their values. And that struggle is more interesting than any struggle against an external villain. So I've never forgotten that. And that's all over my own work. And it also informed my nonfiction book, Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, about the idea that there will be antagonists, but what if the antagonists aren't something external to be defeated? What if it's something more complicated than that? So that quote from George, paraphrasing William Faulkner, but doing a better job of expressing it succinctly, that I will be unpacking that advice for the rest of my writing life. Thank you, George.
Yeah, right. Man, no, that's so good. And you're totally right. Like that is what makes his work so powerful. And that's it's a thing that you could unpack over, yeah, like you said, over and over again, because there are so many facets of the human heart that you can explore. So that's super interesting. And like specifically those writers that you mentioned, I think of Kelly Link. So I took a creative writing program in college. So that was what my degree was in. And one of the books we had to read was Magic for Beginners.
Look
Man,
at you. Good for you.
blew my mind. So I was 20 years old, I think. I'd never read anything like that in my life. And I remember just reading these short stories and I was like, this is possible? How do you even do that? And like, I guess like what did you glean from her? Because she's such a different writer from Chuck and
Yeah.
George.
Yeah, I love Kelly. I'm still in touch with Kelly. I just sent her an email last week. And Kelly and her husband, Gavin Grant, they co-taught. Gavin Grant is an editor, and they ran Small Beer Press, an incredibly experimental and prestigious, radical independent press that explored the interzone between literary and speculative fiction. And Kelly and Gavin gave me the permission to understand that ideas don't have to fit in a particular box. From the work that they were writing and publishing themselves, it just was the permission that I needed. And so that's the biggest thing that I took away from learning from them. And they were both just incredibly smart and warm people. So yeah, that was a beautiful experience to learn with Kelly Link. And I mean, that particular sweet spot that Kelly's work and also Gavin's work as editor for Small Beer Press inhabits, that twilight demilitarized zone between speculative and literary. That's where I go to when I want to read. It's not everything I write,
Sure.
but it's certain. And there is a difference between what writers like to read and what they like to write sometimes. I tend to like things that are, I mean, I'm a sucker for a plot twist, which is why I'm a sucker for the 4-act structure, which is always built on a plot twist. But that's not necessarily what I like to read. And work like Kelly Link's work is absolutely that's my go-to as a reader.
Okay. Okay. I love that. So, okay. So then you come out of that and you published this first short story in 2013. And then I know you had a few more over the years and then sort of get into these young adult novels, so P. Sprout Chen, right? What was that something you were working on parallel to these short stories, or was there like a change that you underwent to be like, I want to try my hand at these longer form works?
It was always part of the plan. Actually, I mentioned that I discovered that there were these workshops called Clarion, one in San Diego, one in Seattle, and that the deadlines were 2 weeks away. Um, I didn't have anything to submit, and so I had been percolating for years this idea of a kung fu figure skating boarding school. And so I just sat down and banged out 3 chapters and just threw it over the fence as my writing application as a sample. And that ended up being my application for the Clarion workshops, but it also ended up being my first 3 chapters of the first P. Sprout Chen novel. But because of scale, I knew that I wanted to get, I had been waiting 42 years to be a writer, and I wanted to get something out in the world. Those horses were ready to charge. And I just thought strategically, well, I mean, I'm kind of afraid of somebody else coming up with the idea of a kung fu figure skating boarding school. So why don't I do, while I'm here at Clarion West and I've got these brilliant minds to guide me, why don't I do a short story or a novelette that's like a proof of concept prototype for the novels that I know will take much longer to write, so that I can lock down that concept as mine and get it out there in the world, and put my mark on that concept. So the novel was always in progress, but I was working on parallel tracks, and I very deliberately wrote one novelette set in the P. Sprout Chen world for George R.R. Martin, and then one for Chuck Palahniuk, and they were both published shortly after I graduated from Clarion. So it just gave me, it gave me practice to write in this world, and I had a lot of fun writing something that was a more manageable scale in this world than a 70,000 word novel. But it also just bought me some emotional release, because I understood I am making visible progress by getting stories out in the world. I am putting planting my flag on this idea of kung fu figure skating, so I don't have to worry about somebody coming in and doing a land grab on this idea before I finish the novel. And it just bought me some relaxation emotionally, so that I could make the novel the best that it could be.
Do you notice a huge difference between how you approach a short story and how you approach a novel, or is it simply just the scale?
Um, I don't approach them any differently, frankly. So maybe I'm a really bad short story writer or a really bad novelist. You put your word on, you put your finger on the correct word, scale. It's just a matter of scale. It's a matter of levels of investigation. That's a term from painting. There's a seminal documentary called Powers of Ten from the 1970s. And it starts out with a man in a park, and he's lying down to take a nap on a picnic blanket. And then it zooms up into space, outer space. And then it comes back down and comes back to the man asleep on the picnic blanket. And then it zooms down to the molecular level in his hand. And I kind of feel like that, I mean, and strangely, I mean, I understand that your podcast is very interdisciplinary. Strangely, that documentary, which is, I saw that in grade school. It's a seminal, mind-blowing work. That documentary was created by 2 interior designers,
Wow.
Charles and Ray Eames, who are, yeah, believe it or not, that was created by Charles and Ray Eames,
No
who,
way.
if you don't know, they are some of the most, they are some of the giants of mid-century modern design. The Eames lounge chair.
Yes.
So like they're making the Eames lounge chair while they're making one of the most famous documentaries of all time. I mean, that's range. But that's how I kind of feel about the difference between short fiction and novel length fiction. It's all the same values, all the same skills, but just a matter of scale.
Do you have, with the scale comes having to chip away at the same thing over and over again? Do you like find that you naturally, and this might not even be the right word, but like the discipline, like do you have to sort of conjure discipline to sit down and work on something longer over time, or is that something that you feel like comes naturally to you and you just do it?
Hang on.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to choose my words carefully here. For all of the writers out there, fatigue is absolutely something that you need to manage. And you need to understand where your wells of inspiration and stamina come from and how they are refilled and how to refill them in a way that is going to integrate with the rest of your life. Because if you don't, then you can produce work that is a reflection not of your potential, but of your fatigue. And then you get imposter syndrome because you're not you don't like your own work, and it's just a matter of you're being tired. Of course you're tired. You've just written 280 pages, and you can see the finish line in sight, and you're trying to drag your corpse over the finish line, and then you end up with something that you're not proud of. And so I want to say a word of care for all writers. It is perfectly fine to take breaks and let the well refill. Now, that said, I approached writing in a different way. I waited half my life. I literally if I'm lucky, that's half of my life. I've literally waited half of my life to start writing. But that also meant that I was bursting with ideas and frustrated artistic ambitions. So I don't have that particular problem of fatigue or loss of motivation because I waited 42 years. But the other thing, and this is something that I emphasize to my writing students, is that more attention needs to be paid to the selection of what story to write and brainstorming multiple ideas to write. And when you choose the right idea that you are excited about, so much else falls away because you can't stop thinking about this. You prefer to be working on this idea than watching your favorite show, reading a book, playing a game, seeing your friends. If you can find that idea, nothing else is as important as finding that idea. Now, that can take time, but I encourage my students to brainstorm 10 ideas and choose one, not just write the one idea that they have been thinking about. I actively give students exercises to brainstorm ideas, and they include taking two ideas and then mashing them together to see what hybrid idea can come out of them, to get them to the idea that they are so excited about that they would prefer to stay at home on a Friday night and write than go out with their friends. That's how I've dealt with motivation and fatigue. I've been brutal in my idea selection process. I only write the idea that I cannot stop thinking about. And I also try to build some joy into the idea that I am writing about. I ask myself, well, what would I like to talk about? That has nothing to do with anything else, whether it's figure skating or video games or boy bands or the 1980s new wave scene, whatever it is there a way you can bring that into your into your work? Because if so, you just put rockets on that work. And so that's how I front load the question of fatigue by building rockets onto the work, onto the concept from the front end. And that's how I've never run out of enthusiasm for the works that I'm working on.
That's a really insightful way of working at it, because you're right. Like if you've solved that up front, it makes the back end so easy. I wish someone would have told me that like 10 years ago. But thank you. It's never too late. So then going from like P Sprout Chen to this new book. So spring, summer, asteroid, bird. So I really want to spend, a lot of time because so many of the ideas from this book were just things that I either had never thought of before or things that you put a name to that I'd sort of been subconsciously thinking about, but didn't know how to talk about. And so, but I just want to give some context for everybody listening who may not have heard it. Do you mind explaining what the book focuses on, just so we have that ground?
Yes, the book is called Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, The Art of Eastern Storytelling. And it is ostensibly a writing craft book or a literary criticism book or kind of a workbook. But for me, it was fundamentally about culture and about ideas and focusing on story structure, which might seem quite dry and academic. But in fact, I see the power of structure in a way that I don't think people talk about enough. So most of us have grown up here in the West, in quotation marks, the West, with Western storytelling, and we are so immersed in the particular obsessions and quirks of Western storytelling that we don't even know that they are culturally specific. Stories about empowerment, about characters finding themselves and finding their voice. Well, it's hard to find a book, especially a book for young people published in the West, that is not about empowerment or self-esteem or finding your voice. And that is not a swing at stories that are about that. We need those stories. They are nutritive. They can save lives. But we also have to understand that they are particularly Western concerns. And David Foster Wallace gave a great parable that is relevant here, and it's the parable of the fish. This old fish swims by these two young fish, and the old fish says, "Water's really nice today, isn't it?" And the young fish don't say anything. And then when the old fish is out of earshot, they say to each other, "What's water?" And that's kind of how we are in the West with regard to the conventions that are specifically Western obsessions. And some of them include stories about conflict and tension built around that. And there are other features of Western storytelling that we think, oh, how would you even write a story that doesn't have any conflict in it? How would you write a story that's not about the character finding themselves or finding their voice or self-empowerment or rising self-esteem arc? That's not even a story. Well, there are other traditions with thousands of years of history that offer alternatives. And that's what I got interested in. I don't even remember when I became aware of some of these different traditions. But my first novel, P. Sprout Chen, which is the Kung Fu Figure Skating Boarding School series, I didn't tell anybody this, but that first novel is written in the East Asian 4-act structure, which is a radically different structure. So Western storytelling is based on, one of the pillars of Western storytelling is the 3-act structure. And the 3-act structure says you've got to introduce all of the main elements right up front. You don't want to write the film Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope and then hide Darth Vader until after the halfway point. People will say, well, where did that come from? Why are you hiding that? Why didn't you set that up? You didn't set that up properly. You don't want to be writing Romeo and Juliet and have the first half be entirely about this guy named Romeo. And then suddenly, after the halfway point, kapow, you hit the audience with an entirely new character named Juliet. People will say, that's not Romeo and Juliet. That's Romeo, then Juliet, because there's no symmetry. You're holding back something for no apparent reason. Well, the East Asian 4-act structure is defined by deliberately holding back a main element until after the halfway point. And that main element arrives as the agent of chaos. It's the asteroid that lands in the middle of the story and just creates chaos. But the ending of the story is looking at what that asteroid, the blast from the asteroid and the debris that's left, what did it reveal that we never saw before? And this happens all the time. We look at catastrophic events in the world, whether it's natural disasters, and learning that those levees were never properly maintained in New Orleans, learning that those buildings in Sichuan, China, that all collapsed and killed hundreds of school children, that they were not properly constructed, possibly because of bribes due to corruption. We learn these things when these catastrophes happen, and that includes in our own lives. We become ill, and then suddenly we learn who our real friends are. Like it or not, the universe is going to throw an asteroid into your path. And that asteroid might reveal things that were always there that you hadn't seen before. And that is the particular obsession of the 4-act structure, completely different from the 3-act structure. And I stealthily wrote my first novel, the Kung Fu figure skating novel, Peace Route Chen, in that structure. And I didn't tell anybody, I didn't tell my agent, I didn't tell my editor, and nobody's ever commented on it. So even though this might sound like a really weird structure to withhold Juliet or Darth Vader until the second half, it managed to work. Whatever complaints people might have had about the novel, it wasn't about the structure. So I am very interested, though, in the idea that structures don't come from nowhere,
right?
That values dictate structures. And the way that I see this particular structure, the East Asian 4-act structure, and why it's obsessed with subverting expectations by holding something back and then detonating it after the halfway point and then looking at the debris. I feel like this comes from Buddhism and Taoism, which are very interested in the idea of relinquishing individual ego and relinquishing expectations. And that is something that it can be seem very antithetical to Western storytelling's values, which is all about individualism, all about owning your power, finding your voice. Well, in some ways, Buddhism and Taoism is all about seemingly negating your individuality. And that's a hard sell in the West. But it's not about the denigration of the individual. It is, in my opinion, a loving thing to do for the individual, because according to these ancient schools of thought, if you are able to let go or relax your ego and relax your grip on expectations, what that means is when that asteroid comes in your life, and believe it or not, it is going to come. If you have more relaxed expectations, you might be able to receive that unexpected, unwelcome thing in your life story with more grace, more balance, more wisdom. And you might be able to see what was lying there in plain view that was invisible before, and therefore turn this calamity into something nourishing. That's very interesting to me. The idea that a religion, and Taoism is a philosophy / religion, but that these schools of thought that are ancient can manifest in the actual shape of the story. And it led me to the revelation that values do dictate structures. And we see that. This is not unique to East Asian culture. We see that in the layout of cathedrals. The footprint of a cathedral is very specific. It looks like this.
Yes.
What does this look like? So the values are reflected in the actual forms. The footprint of the cathedral is literally a cross. That is not an accident. They went to great care to make sure that the values are reflected in the forms. And it happens in things like gardening. In architecture, forms do reflect values. Values do dictate structures. And that is very interesting to me, because once you know that there is this relationship between the values that you are exploring in a work and the structure, you can lean into it harder and make it more effective, because now you put a name on something. You've given yourself X-ray specs to see what you're doing, and now you can stop all of those labors and say, stop making this cathedral into a straight line. We need to add a second bar to make it a cross. Now you can lean into what you want to express, because you've realized there is this great potential in the actual form that you hadn't thought about before. And that's very exciting to me as an artist. And it's not something I hear writers talking about enough.
Yeah, like that idea of because I've read books on form before, but like you mentioned earlier, like when you were giving the disclaimer, you're like, this sounds like it's dry, but it's not. And I agree. Like the book was riveting. Like I really enjoyed it, and it was a huge page turner. And I think part of that is what you just said, is that connection that maybe a lot of us feel subconsciously, which is the values are informing the form. Form is not just about how you organize things. Well, it is, but like that is an outflow of all these other things. And the example you gave of Mulan, the original poem Mulan, and then the Disney movie, and how sort of that idea, I think I have the quote written down here, like it was something to the effect of cultural appropriation is not just taking ideas from another culture. Rather, it's the practice of selectively or randomly using cosmetic aspects of the culture while failing to appreciate the larger cultural context from which they came. So it's like you're telling the story, you're on surface level, you're using these aesthetics, but you're not lined up with the values. And you were mentioning how the values of Mulan, like the traditional poem, are in some ways the exact opposite of how Disney represented that in the film. And I found that really, really interesting.
Yeah, apologies to all the 90s kids out there. I loved the film Mulan as well, but I also understand there's a difference between a guilty pleasure or something that is comfort food culture. There's a difference between that and a meaningful exploration of a culture that's not your own. And so what you're talking about is there are a number of things that the Disney animated version of Mulan did that were, I don't even know if they realized they were doing this. They probably thought, let's fix this poem. It's a great concept. A woman warrior in disguise goes into battle pretending that she's a man. It's a great concept, but let's fix that original story because it's not good enough. Let's make it better. And they thought they would make it better by making it about her finding herself, about her throwing off her family's expectations. So in some ways, it's about her rebelling against her family. And in fact, the original poem is not about rebelling against the family at all. It is absolutely about honoring her family. And I think that it's interesting because that poem, I think, is 700 years old, but it ends up being more radical in terms of identity politics than this 20th century film, because the 20th century adaptation, this is 20 some years ago. Maybe an animated version would be made differently now, but it falls into the trap of thinking, okay, if we want to have a strong female character, we have to have her disdain pretty things. Yep. She has to hate makeup. She has to hate dresses. She has to hate those things. And that's the only way you can really be a strong female character. And I think that's just very reductive and very binary. And then also there's a subtext there because, like, what about all those girls who want to be strong, but they also like pink.
Right.
What's so bad about liking pink? Why can't you do both? And that original poem, which is 700 years old. Okay, yeah, Mulan does dress up as a soldier and ride into battle and do her part and do well, and she is honored because she did well as a soldier. But what does she do when the war is over? Well, she doesn't decide to carry on the imposture, doesn't decide to carry on to more military glory. She decides to go back home to her family. And the first thing she does is she puts on her dress and she puts on her makeup. And so it's playing with the idea that these things are not mutually exclusive, that strong is not mutually incompatible with pretty, and that we don't have to be shaming girls if they like pretty. It is not mutually incompatible. And I find that a lot more exciting and a lot more forward thinking than the very reductive binary that if you like pretty things, you're not really a strong female, which I hate that so much.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really powerful example, and I love the fact that you mentioned that the movie flopped in mainland China because of that sort of not understand. Like you said, they probably were trying to fix it, but it just robbed it of the sort of the cultural values. How do you feel that someone who's learning about this for the first time, right? Maybe they read your book and they're like, wow, okay, like I'm really interested in these other cultures and I want to make sure I represent them fairly in my own work. Like, what work do you feel like someone could do in order to get better at respectfully interacting with things that they're not born into?
That's great. I mean, I don't blame people. Well, first of all, for any writers that have this impulse, they want to explore more, but they are also respectful and maybe a little trepidatious about making a wrong move. I mean, thank you for even wanting to do this. This is how the world goes forward. Thank you for wanting and trying to do this. And I also want to say it can be very hard to understand what water is when you've been in water your entire life. It'll become invisible to you, and it can take time. I would recommend a book and a workshop called Writing the Other. The book is written by Nisi Shawl and Cynthia Ward, and the workshop is run by Nisi Shawl and Tempest Bradford. And they do a very deep exploration in their various workshops, some of which are available on demand and affordable. And they also have scholarships for their workshops addressing this very issue for the people who want to learn how to represent people with different lived experiences and backgrounds, who want to write the other, but want to do it respectfully and do it well. How do we get there? Well, this workshop gives people a lot of instruction on how to get there. So I absolutely recommend you check out Writing the Other. Just Google Writing the Other. You'll find their website and their roster of classes.
Amazing. I'll make sure I link to that too in the description. So for anybody who's listening and wants to check that out, it sounds phenomenal. So one of the other things, talking about this concept of water, right? Swimming in these sort of cultural things that you don't think are cultural. In my head, I totally am guilty of that. Like growing up here in the United States and thinking that a story, like the whole idea of like Chekhov's gun and like the idea that you have a contract with the reader to introduce everything that's going to show up at the end in the first act, right? And I love that you mentioned that sort of a characteristic of, again, generalizing, but Western stories. And then you were talking about how in Eastern stories, it's almost like the contract is that you promise to swerve out of the expected lane. And that's like expected. I was wondering if you could speak to that concept a little bit.
Yeah.
Because that was interesting.
Yeah. And I want to reiterate that, and I appreciate you're trying to get away from binaries and monoliths. Of course, there are Western stories that aren't that tidy and that predictable. Of course, there are East Asian stories that aren't told in the 4-act structure. But we're talking about general tendencies, and there can be value in noting general tendencies. So the idea of the 4-act structure, it kind of does promise, you're going to get 2 stories for the price of one. And you're going to get, and they might be entirely different genres. And it's not a universal practice among East Asian stories. As I said, there are plenty of classic and contemporary East Asian books and films and TV shows that are not in the East Asian 4-act structure. So it's not so ubiquitous and universal that it becomes predictable. But there is, I mean, who doesn't like a plot twist? And that's partly what how people respond to this promise to swerve into a different lane, perhaps an entirely different genre, in the third of 4 acts after the halfway point. If it's done well, it's delightful. I'm not, as I said, I'm a big sucker for a plot twist. Now, there might be some people that just don't like the disorientation that comes from that. But there is a long tradition. We're hundreds. I don't know how long the history of the 4-act structure is, but we're talking at least 800, 900 years of history, and clearly this idea that there is the unexpected, expect the unexpected, and we don't know what form that's going to take, but you will be in free fall at some point in this story. That is a feature of the 4-act structure. And for me, that's a big feature, not a bug.
Absolutely, yeah. And you gave the example of one of them that I thought was really good was Matilda, how all the telekinesis shows up, and you're like, whoa, okay, telekinesis is here. This is not what I thought was happening. But you know, as a kid reading that, you don't think twice. You just kind of accept it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Matilda. When I had been thinking about these ideas. I was actually in the middle of the book, writing Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird when I first discovered Matilda, and I was like, whoa! This guy Roald Dahl managed to reinvent the wheel for himself. He discovered this structure for himself, and that happens because artists are incredible, and they will look at their story or their project and ask themselves, what form will serve this best? And they can arrive at a conclusion that actually has hundreds or thousands of years of tradition in another culture, but they have no knowledge of that. And that makes me so impressed by artists generally, that they can invent something, they can carry the weight of invention that an entire culture has borne. They can invent that wheel themselves. But also the idea that some of these things resonate in a universal way across cultural prejudices. Some of these things can be universal, and that's inspiring to think about. But yeah, Matilda's a great example. Sorry if you've not read Matilda, we just totally spoiled it.
Spoilers for Matilda.
Yeah, it seems to be. It seems to be a stylized but realistic story up until after the halfway point, when suddenly there's telekinesis in the story, and it just comes out of nowhere. That is classic 4-act structure.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really loved as you were talking about the 4-act structure and sort of circular narratives and stuff too, so we can probably step into that realm, was video games.
Yeah.
And I had never thought of video games. So I'd obviously thought of the narrative of video games, but not the narrative of like a level construction of a side scroller, or you broke down a Legend of Zelda boss fight and how that fits into the structure. How did that sort of connection to video games come about? And like, what do you see as you look at the structure of video game design?
Well, I'm a big gamer. I love video games. I find the field incredibly exciting. There's just so much chaotic creativity. But what I find interesting about video games, and the reason that I go from Nobel Prize winning writers to Mario games in this book as case studies, is that there is this idea of interactivity in many art forms. And how do we increase reader engagement, reader and viewer investment. And with static forms like books and films and music, we depend on devices like character development, beautiful prose, compelling world building, but they are all in service of the goal of increasing engagement with the work. How do we make people fall into the work and feel like they are interacting with the work, living in the work? Okay, and so we have thousands of years of artists trying to solve that problem of interactivity with static stories. Then along come video games, and the interactivity is built right in there. You don't have to empathize with the character. You are the character, and your decisions are going to determine whether you live or die. And so the video games excited me as a storyteller because they just bypass thousands of years of struggle on how to jerry-rig devices to increase interactivity in our engagement with stories. And they just go right there. They just put you right in the story. So that's why I started to look at video games with this critical lens. And then, lo and behold, my Nintendo Switch just became this X-ray. And I saw these worlds that were already built on these structures. And so we've talked about the 4-act structure. And Nintendo, and as I say in the book, Nintendo shockingly was founded much longer ago than we think. It was founded before the end of the Ottoman Empire, believe it or not. And Nintendo has a long history, and it's got the code of the 4-act structure built into many of its games, including its Mario and Zelda games. But even more than that, I was noticing that video games often are aggressively non-linear, and the book Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird doesn't just talk about the 4-act structure. It also talks about circular structures and nested structures, which are very similar, but basically they are non-linear structures where you will go in circles and you will repeat, and that's an important part of the experience. Now, most Western storytelling is linear. And not all, obviously, but as a rule of thumb, it's mostly linear. Well, there are so many video games that are where you have to repeat, and it's part of the fun to be able to repeat. And the example that I give, I mean, there are many examples, but the example I gave, because I was very in love with my Nintendo Switch when I was writing this book, so I was sticking to Nintendo games. And there's a Nintendo series called Metroid. And they are a science fiction action adventure game. And the defining feature of these games is that you will see clues in the environment around you that you don't know the purpose of, and you cannot take advantage of until later on. You might see some sort of, some object way up high, but you can't jump that high. And then later on, you discover a way to put, these rockets on your boots so you can do a double jump. And oh, wait a minute, where was that? A cliff way up? And then you're scrambling back. You are going back and replaying that arena where you couldn't reach that cliff before, but now you can with this new double jump ability. And the game keeps folding on itself over and over, forcing you to observe your environment with greater care, because something that seems irrelevant now might become not just irrelevant, but critical later on. And that, to go back to the idea of interactivity, this is very powerful interactivity. You're being forced to observe your environment. It's like kind of like reading a mystery book where you have to be looking for clues. When you sign up, you're going to be looking for clues. They're going to be there. In that locked library with the dead body, there are clues there, but you don't know. The clues do not announce themselves, and you are being taught to experience the story with greater observational skills. But the difference between the Metroid games and an Agatha Christie mystery is that nobody's going to put those clues together for you. You've got to put them together, or else you're going to be stuck in that game. You're not going to be able, you'll never be able to figure out, where do I go next? How do I get up to that thing up there? If you don't put it together, nobody's going to put it together for you. Inspector Poirot is not going to put it together for you. He's not going to jump up there for you. You've got to do that. And you've got to figure it out. You've got to watch the clues. And that is the satisfaction of it. So there are many video games that exploit this idea of a circular or a nested structure where we are expecting to revisit things over and over again, but each time with new insight. And that can give players the delicious experience of seeing the world with new eyes, of finding the secrets lying in plain view. And that's something that I'm very enamored of as well. Not going somewhere new necessarily, but seeing the world around you that you're already in with new eyes. I love that, and these circular nested stories give us that. But they also make you have to solve the mystery.
Right, right. And so I love kind of the idea how not only do the values determine the structure, but like the book also mentions that the story itself sort of calls for a certain structure in the themes that it's examining and stuff like that. And one of the examples that you gave in the circular section is, man, the title of the story is blanking. I'm blanking on it right now. The Ted Chiang.
The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate.
Oh my gosh.
Let's repeat that. Let's just repeat that for the sake of all the listeners, because this is one of the greatest short fiction works of all time. It's called The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate by Ted Chiang, Chiang. And I have no desire to ever write a time travel story because clearly the best one has already been written.
He beat the game. I mean, so I had never heard of it, right? So I read your book, and immediately after I finished Spring, Summer, Asteroid, Bird, I went and I was going to go to the library and check it out, but I came across Exhalations, that collection that has it in there by Ted Chiang, and I read that story, and I was just like, how does a human being write this story? But the point that the reason I bring that up is because it examines free, and I'm not going to spoil it or anything, but free will and fate, and sort of the relationship between those two things, and it does it in this circular structure, and so. We can riff on that story if you want, but one part of the question that I have too is like, for the writer out there, me, all the listeners, everybody, right, as we're like approaching stories and we're looking for like, what form is this story supposed to be? What sort of advice do you have on how much do you write into a structure, or how much do you write and then look for the structure that's emerging? Does that question make sense? It's a little bit hard to articulate.
Hold on, marinating. I am a little hesitant to give this advice because I don't want people to get lost with this advice. But the way that I work is I will toggle back and forth between creation and contemplation. So that means that I will write, but then I will study or research. And that research can include, reading books like my book, or taking a class with Writing the Other, or it can just be watching. I mean, in my book, I recommend many books and films and video games, and I absolutely recommend, they are each of them an education. And so that contemplation can include sitting down and reading The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate. And then I will return to my work, and often my understanding of what that work needs has changed because of that. And then I'll work on more, and then I'll toggle back into contemplation mode. So I'm always toggling back and forth. Now, I share that with hesitation because I can imagine a writer with a less clear, strong vision ending up with a mess because of that. And I don't have a tidy answer for you. I will say that the more that you study, the more that you practice writing, the steadier your grip will be on where your balance is. I'm mixing up metaphors here. Sure. Where your balance is between external inspiration and internal vision. I mean, that's ultimately what we're doing. What I'm doing. I am doing a triangulation between my inner vision, my inner world, and the world without. And I can have, because I've done this enough, I can negotiate the right middle point for me. But that is something that takes time. And you give, please give yourself permission to create a mess.
Yes.
I'm personally, as a reader, I am always more interested in the interesting splatters than I am in the perfect splash.
Yeah, right. That makes a ton of sense. Okay. But there's a few other questions I have as we're getting close to wrapping up. But is there anything before we sort of move a little bit away from spring, summer, asteroid, bird? Is there anything that you think that maybe we missed talking about that you'd like people to either know about the book, or a concept that jumps out to you that maybe we missed, or do you feel like we gave everybody a good teaser?
You were very thorough in covering the things that I hope that we would cover, and you actually gave a nice bird's eye flyover of the shape of the book. And I will, just for my own indulgence, I would like to share that there is a theme song for the book. If you look on my website, there is a theme song, and it's actually told in the 4-act structure.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second then. Music, right? So you do other things besides, write. And so sort of the multidisciplinary thing. Like, how do you approach music? Is it something that do you approach it similar to writing, or is it like a totally different thing?
First of all, I am not a musician. I am not a singer. I'm just a passionate hobbyist. But yeah, yay for passionate hobbyists.
Yes.
And I've always been interested in music. I love music. Many people love music, and I find that even if you're not good at something, it can be satisfying to attempt something that you love. And so I've always played music. And always been adjacent to music. But when my first novel, Peace Brow Chen, Future Legend of Skate and Sword, was coming out, I was starting to think about what I wanted to do for the author appearances. And this is a world that it's an Asian fantasy in a world that visually looks very different from our world. The entire academy and the city where the academy is located, where the book takes place, is built of this substance that looks like ice but never melts, and it's dry, and it's warm rather than wet and cold. And in fact, the mystery of what this substance is becomes the central mystery in the books. But visually, it's very specific, and I knew that for these author appearances, I wanted something from this world. I created banners of the map of the academy, but I wanted something more than a representation, because those banners are a picture of something. I wanted the actual something from the world, but I couldn't create this substance. I couldn't do the kung fu figure skating moves. And I know that because I took 6 months of kung fu and figure skating lessons to try to invent this sport, and I failed spectacularly. So I couldn't. I wanted very much to have something from the world that was as real in our world as their world, not a representation of something, not a picture of something from their world. I wanted the actual thing, but I had no ability to create any of those things, even if they weren't tangible things and they were the kung fu figure skating forms. It was beyond my skill level to do that. And then I asked myself, well, what else could be as real in our world as their world? And then I came across the idea, a song. Yeah. A song could be as real in our world as their world. That is something I can pluck from their world and bring into our world. And so I wrote a theme song for that first book, and I've been writing theme songs for all my books ever since.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. What? So, okay, so in teaching writing, is there like any like pieces of advice that seem to resonate with tons of people? So what I mean by that is like there's so many aspects of writing and so many aspects of creativity, but it seems like at least from the writers I've talked to and in myself, there's certain things that maybe are the most common struggles when it comes to writing or creativity. Can you think off the top of your head, like in your classes or courses or workshops or anything that you've taught, things that seem to really make a difference for people, maybe one or two?
I can think of two. The two things that distinguish my classes from most other classes that I know about. One of them is I am a big fan of structure, obviously, because I think that, I mean, I feel like I'm a pretty smart person, but I cannot hold in my own mind 350 pages of a book. I will never be able to hold that all in mind. And I know that if I did not outline what I what I would write might have its merits, but it would not be everything I wanted it to be. And that there are some types of stories that are simply out of reach if you don't outline. And if you don't outline, you have to ask yourself, why don't you outline? There can be legitimate reasons. Maybe you are a very instinctive writer and the outlining would kill something because it is too bright a light that is acting as an antiseptic to your very instinctive process. Okay, that's great. I mean, if you're David Lynch, I'm not going to ask you to outline your movies ahead of time. I get it. But if your reason is, if your honest reason is, I don't outline because that seems like a monumental task and that's triggering all sorts of emotions, that's not a good reason to run away from it. Your reason for outlining or not outlining should not be based on your feelings. It should be based on what is good for your process. And so I spend a full 3 weeks with my students creating something that I call a plot grid. And the plot grid is a spreadsheet. It's a table where we look at what every scene is doing and we mark off which threads it's hitting. And then we know, oh, that character, the love interest, has been gone for 80 pages. And there's no way I can hold all of those things in mind. There are dozens of things we need to be keeping track of. You know, it's been, we had 3 fight scenes within 30 pages, and then there's 80 pages without a fight scene. Do we want that? Was that deliberate, or was that because I can only hold in mind 5 pages at a time? I don't have the ability to hold a 350-page novel all in mind at one time. The laborious process of creating that plot grid gives me an X-ray. So like at a glance, I can see at least a third of the novel. And it's, you know what, I feel like it's a kindness to yourself to front load, but then offload the thinking of keeping track of all of those things to this document. You don't when you sit down to write, you don't have to worry about, oh my gosh, did I forget something? Have I left out a character for too long? Do I have too many similar scenes at the same time? No, you don't have to worry about that because the document will track it for you. That spreadsheet will track it for you. And now you can be here now and write the scene and only do what it needs to do because you already have pre-planned what it needs to do. Now, this works for some people, but I do encourage everybody to go through such a process. And in the process, and once again, I'm a big fan of triangulating. Maybe going through this process, you realize, okay, there is some value in this. I see the value in being able to do an X-ray so that I can offload, delegate the tracking of the rhythm of the appearance of certain things to this document. But this is really killing my Zen. And I'm not able to tap into the improvisation that is the hallmark of my work. And so I've got to find some middle ground for myself. But don't not to do it because of feelings. That's the wrong reason. That's the wrong reason to avoid it. And the other advice for writers that I already talked about is to invest a lot of time in brainstorming a multitude of stories to write. And in my classes, once again, we'd spend a full 3 weeks before I allowed the students to even write anything, even a paragraph. And those 3 weeks are spent in looking at the stories that they are thinking about writing and interrogating them, and then doing a number of mad exercises around them, such as, for example, taking two of them and mashing them together to see whether you can come up with a hybrid story that involves more than one concept. Because that's exercising a different muscle, an underutilized, atrophied muscle in most writers' minds. We think of writing as being about invention, about writers creating things out of thin air, but I feel like the contribution of an artist can also be to see the invisible connections between even two randomly put together things. We are wired as a species for pattern recognition. And when you do an exercise like, okay, take two stories you've been thinking about writing, put them together into one story, and then ask yourself, what is the connection between them? It is exercising the muscle in our brain wired for pattern recognition, which is ancient. We have survived as a species because we've been able to notice, oh, when I eat that pretty fuzzy red berry, I am sick for a week. I see a pattern here. It is so deep in our brains, and we don't use that enough as writers. And that's why I have my writers do exercises like mash together two ideas into one. It's exercising a different muscle. And so I run them through a gauntlet of different exercises for 3 weeks. So they have choices. And then we objectively look at the choices. Which story are you most excited about? Which story do you feel is most unique? Let's be honest. Is this another werewolf boarding school story? Do you have a unique take on a werewolf boarding school story that we haven't seen before? And so we rank them according to various objective categories. And then the students finally, at the end of this 3-week gauntlet, can make their choice. But now they can make a more informed choice. They are not making a choice to write a story because they have nothing else to choose from. Now they have choices. So I'm a fan of that part of the process as well. Aiming your firepower on coming up with an entire bouquet of ideas to explore, not just that one thing because you think you don't have any other choices. There are always choices.
Oh, that's so good. Okay. Last question, and this one sometimes stumps people, but what are 3 books that you would recommend everybody check out, either because they meant something to you or they just have something really fascinating? Just three things. 3 books.
Okay, the hard part of this question is limiting it to 3. Okay, the first one is a book called The Arrival by Shaun Tan, Shauntan. And Shaun Tan is a Chinese-Australian writer and illustrator. He ostensibly writes children's books, but these are masterpieces of literature. And his greatest book is called The Arrival. It's an entirely wordless book that seems to be, and it's all done in this sepia-toned realistic style, so it looks like old-timey photographs. And it seems to be about immigration from Eastern Europe, maybe, to America through Ellis Island at first, until you arrive at this destination and you realize this is so not New York. This is unlike any city I've ever seen before. Everything is different. The writing script is different. The animals are different. The weather is different. The architecture is different. They have the sidewalks are maps. The clocks are made out of these floral patterns. Everything is wildly different, and it is bewildering, but it's also wondrous, and it is fundamentally an exercise in empathy. Because it's come as close as I can think of to creating an entirely invented culture, like a visual, linguistic, biological. Everything is different because none of us has ever seen anything like this before. I mean, it's not derived from medieval Europe. It's not derived from Tokugawa era Japan. It's unlike anything. Because it's unlike anything. It means that every reader can get the experience of what it's like to be an immigrant. And And I will just add, when I read The Arrival, I lent the book to my dad, and my dad, we're all from Taiwan, but my dad came over earlier than we did to lay the foundation for our making the leap from Taiwan to America. And this was in the early 1970s, and it was not easy. He didn't have higher education. He didn't have great English skills. He had, I think, $100 in his pocket, and it was very hard for him to try to make his way and set a foundation for the rest of our family to come over. And I am deeply grateful that he went through that effort for us. And so here is this book that is about immigration, but it's a children's illustrated book. And my dad is not a reader, and certainly not a children's book reader, certainly not a children's illustrated book reader. So when I handed him the book, he was quite baffled. And I said, Dad, just read it. And then the next week we met for lunch, and he brought the book back, and he just handed it to me without saying anything. He's not a man of many words. And I said, oh, okay. Did you read it? And he said, yes. And I said, what did you think of it? And he said, this is exactly how it was for me. That is the power of literature. So the Arrival by Sean Tan would be my number one choice. The next book that I would recommend would be The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. And you probably have heard of The Three-Body Problem because of the Netflix series. And the Netflix series scrambles a lot, but does a pretty good job of capturing the spirit of it. It is just it's just the wildest ride I think I've ever read. It just, there is something very specific about Chinese culture, and Cixin Liu is a Chinese writer, and it's the scale that this book is very comfortable playing in that feels very Chinese. This is a culture that makes 3,000 mile long walls, and in that way, the Three-Body Problem and the other two books in the trilogy, they play with scale in a way that is just dizzying, and on top of that, they're just wildly inventive. There are so many things I have literally never seen before. Like, how do you make a computer with 10,000 men and a bunch of semaphore flags? Well, it takes these thought experiments and it runs them through, and it's just like, I feel like this writer has endless imagination. So the Three-Body Problem would be another recommendation. And then the final one would be, my most reread book is a book named Zero History by William Gibson. And William Gibson is a science fiction writer who is most known for the book Neuromancer, which basically invented cyberpunk. And at some point in the early 21st century, he stopped writing science fiction and he wrote a trilogy of realist fiction because he said that I don't feel like I have to write science fiction now because the future has caught up with us. We are living in a world that is as strange as anything in my novels. And he wrote a trilogy, and the last book in the trilogy is called Zero History. And it is a very hard thing to understand the flavor of the decade or the time you're living in while you're living in it. This book does that, and it shows us what a strange and wondrous world we are living in now. So Zero History would be my third recommendation.
Man, that is a stacked list. I've read the first two. I've not read Zero History, but The Arrival, like you said, the felt experience of being the way that he conjured that experience is just mind-blowing.
I'm so glad you know it.
Yeah. Oh, anyways, that's awesome. I'll have to check out Zero History. So
please do. It is the best of the trilogy. He has saved the best for last.
So, but it probably requires the first two, though, right?
If you only have time for one, you can fast forward to Zero History, but you will be missing out on some huge Easter eggs, some very emotionally satisfying Easter eggs.
Okay. So as we wrap up here, what if you want to share, is there anything that you're working on now that you're excited about? And if there's stuff that you don't want to talk about, maybe just plug whatever you wanna plug here at the end.
I have just finished my latest project. I can't talk about it. I will say it is a genre that I call a musical novel. So it is a novel with an accompanying album of songs. and I can't talk more about it. But check out my website. I am constantly updating my website with stuff, including some free stuff. If you check out henrylien.com, there's good stuff on there, including some free stuff.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Henry, thank you so much. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate this. Yeah. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed meeting you. I enjoy your work a lot. I've read about half your stuff. I'm halfway through the first
Thank
Peace
you.
Sprout Chen book
Thank
right
you.
now, so I'm going to keep going on that. I'm loving it so far. So
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm very happy to be here, happy to be engaging with your listeners and your viewers. Thank you.
Always choose orange.
thank you so much for checking out this episode of Always Choose Orange. Please subscribe to the channel for more conversations like this, as well as some solo episodes where we look at different perspectives around creativity and provide some exercises for you to jumpstart your own creative process.
Always choose orange.